We are officially in the slog leading up to the NFL draft. It's always around this time of the month of April where it feels like, man, can it just be here already? Can we just get to the draft? Can we stop overanalyzing all these guys? But since we have the time, we might as well use it to our advantage. I'm John Sheeran of A to Z Sports Cincinnati. This is A to Z Sports Cincinnati. If you are new to the channel, consider subscribing, comment who you want the Bengals to draft in the 2026 NFL draft. It really helps out the channel and allows us to make more videos just like this. And follow us on, obviously, YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, wherever you get your short form content. A to Z Sports Cincinnati will be there leading up to the NFL draft, covering the NFL draft, breaking down what happened in the NFL draft. One of the problems with the Bengals is that they very rarely change, right? They very rarely evolve in ways that they probably should. But the benefit of that, at least from our perspective, from my perspective, is that they can be very easy to predict what they actually will do, right? Sometimes it gets a little bit difficult. Sometimes they do end up surprising. The first round of the NFL draft, however, is not an area of the Bengals in which they deviate from what they normally do. And now that we're just a couple weeks away from the draft, we're starting to see predictions about who the Bengals are actually going to pick. We've seen countless mock drafts at this point predicting what the Bengals are going to do with the 10th overall pick. We've had a month of free agency to kind of alter our expectations a little bit. And the Bengals have done a lot of work to set themselves up as best as they can with that pick. They could do a little bit more, but I think they're in a pretty decent spot to not waste that pick entirely on a player that's not worth that pick at all. And mock drafts are also the engine that determines, odds about who's going to be the pick at whatever pick that you're looking at, right? So the 10th overall pick now, the favorite to be that pick is Caleb Downs, just because Caleb Downs has been the most mocked player to the Bengals in mock drafts around the internet. Right behind him, you have Ruben Bain, Mansour Delane, Jermon McCoy, Sonny Styles. And all those names make sense because they've all been mocked to the Bengals several times over the past couple of months. And yet all the way down this list of players that I was looking at in terms of odds of being the Bengals pick was Jeremiah Love, who is at 18-1 right now. But unlike many of the potential favorites to be the Bengals pick, Jeremiah Love has actually made a 30 visit with the Bengals. While Love, who is the consensus top running back in this year's NFL draft class, has already visited with the Tennessee Titans and the New York Giants, two teams who pick in the top 5, the Bengals did want to make a visit with Love official. They actually already talked to him at Notre Dame's Pro Day. They had running backs coach Justin Hill go out there and see him work out and then chat with him afterwards. They clearly like Love as a person, and there's nothing really to dislike about him as a player. The data tells you that he is a surefire pick at the running back spot. And despite the overall risks of drafting a running back that high, because you make him such a highly paid player at that position, and the position is so dependent upon the situation around the running back as well. Like, you don't want to end up like Saquon Barkley with the Giants or potentially Ashton Genty with the Raiders, right? You want to make sure that if you do draft a running back that high, he ends up within an offense that has the infrastructure to support him. And the Bengals potentially do have that with a competent offensive line and obviously the plethora of weapons around Joe Burrow. But I still saw a lot of mixed reactions to this news. Like, why are the Bengals actually interested in potentially drafting a running back with their first round pick? They have so many other needs on the defensive side of the ball. Maybe it would even be smarter to draft an offensive lineman to potentially back up Amarius Mims and Orlando Brown at tackle, or potentially, take over for Dalton Reisner after a year at guard. Personally, I think this is just very smart due diligence. I think there's a case for Love being the best overall player in this year's draft, and the running back class in general is very weak, with Love just clearly sticking out like a sore thumb. And if the board falls a certain way in which your top defensive targets are no longer on the board at 10th overall and somehow Love slipped through the cracks, he could very well be the best player available, and that's just a situation in which the Bengals would just have to pivot and then address the defense later on. But the Bengals' interest in Love is not shocking at all to me. He comes from a major program in Notre Dame. He was mighty productive. The tape looks phenomenal. He looks like a phenomenal athlete, even if he didn't test all the way in terms of his testing data. But when we're talking about the Bengals using a first-round pick, one data point seems to matter more than anything else, and that's age. Listed here are the youngest players projected to go in the first round in the 2026 draft. I looked at a consensus board with the top 20 players and looked at anyone who is 21 or younger. There are a handful of players who are still going to be 20 years old when Thursday night of the draft rolls around, and there are definitely a lot of guys who are 21. I included Vega alone in here because we don't know his age officially. We're going to find that out later this week when the Athletics' Dane Brugger releases his draft guide called The Beast, which has ages of basically every player eligible for the draft. But he was in college for 4 years at Penn State. We don't know officially what his age is, but I just included him here regardless. And the reason why I pull up this list is because I think the Bengals' first round pick is going to be amongst this list. In the Zach Taylor era, going back to 2019, the only Bengals first round pick who wasn't 21 or younger when he was drafted was Joe Burrow. And quarterbacks in general are more like their own entity, right? You scout them differently, you evaluate them differently. You don't care that Joe Burrow was 23 years old when he was drafted. But look at every other player that the Bengals have drafted since Zach Taylor was hired in 2019 in the first round. Jonah Williams was 21 years old coming out of Alabama. Jamar Chase was 21 years old coming out of LSU. Dax Hill was 21 years old coming out of Michigan. Myles Murphy, 21 years old out of Clemson. Marius Mims, 21 years old out of Georgia. Shamar Stewart last year, 21 years old out of Texas A&M. And who was amongst this list of 20 to 21 years old? You guessed it, Jeremiah Love. Of all the incorrect things the Bengals may value when it comes to evaluating NFL draft prospects, age is definitely not one of them. I do think it's smart for the Bengals to invest in younger players with their earliest draft picks. Sometimes it means that those players aren't necessarily ready to be elite contributors right away, right? But if you get them into the building when they're really young, you allow them to develop into their peak physical form, by the time that they're in the middle or towards the end of that rookie contract, they start to become the best versions of themselves. And any player that you draft in the first round, you should be prioritizing to extend once that rookie contract expires. And you want to make sure that when you extend that player, you're still getting a high quality player throughout the duration of his second contract. Jamar Chase, I think, is like the ultimate exception to this rule because he came into the league again at 21 years old and immediately was one of the best receivers in the NFL. But I think it's very clear that the 25-year-old version of Jamar Chase that we saw last year was even better than the 21-year-old version that we saw as a rookie. And this was especially the case for the 24-year-old version in 2024 when he won the Triple Crown. The Bengals made Jamar Chase the highest paid receiver in NFL history, and they are expecting to get an inordinate amount of value for that contract. And it definitely helps when a player like Chase signs that contract when he's still in his mid-20s. The Bengals always think long-term. For better or worse, they always think about multiple years into the future. So when they invest a first-round pick in someone who's 20 or 21 years old, they are expecting by the time that they're 24 and 25 that they are just entering their physical peak, and they will be continuing to play at a high level throughout the duration of their 20s. So if they do sign them to a second contract, they end up being worth that second contract. But this is still a list of about 15 players that the Bengals may draft. That's not exactly a shortened down list. That's not exactly a bold thing for me to say that the Bengals are going to take one of these 15 players. So let's go ahead and cut it in half. These 7 players who are all 20 or 21 years old, I think are the prime targets for the Bengals with their 10th overall pick. Now, obviously, there's going to be 9 players picked ahead of them, so not every one of these guys are going to be available. In fact, I would venture to bet that the majority of them are going to be off the board by the time the Bengals are picking. Arvil Reese, Love, Styles, even Ruben Bain, I would probably expect to be taken within the first 9 picks. The only one of those 4 that I think has a legitimate chance of making it to 10th overall is Ruben Bain. And that's why out of these somewhat realistic options amongst this list, I think that Ruben Bain Jr. is going to be the Bengals pick. I don't think they would pick him over Sonny Styles, Jeremiah Love, or Arvil Reese, but I do think that, again, he has the best chance of making it out of those 4. And if he does make it, I expect him to be the pick. But I'm significantly more confident that Jermod McCoy, Peter Woods, and Keldrick Falk are going to be available at 10th overall. And out of those 3, I would expect Jermod McCoy to be the preference. Woods and Falk will continue to be a part of this conversation as potential trade back options, I think. If they, for whatever reason, don't like drafting McCoy at 10th overall, maybe they trade back and McCoy goes off the board and they end up in the teens, and all of a sudden they're looking at potentially their top defensive tackle in Peter Woods and a guy like Falk who can rush from the inside as well. I don't think that either of them are like legitimate options with the 10th overall pick, but again, they meet the age requirement. They're from major schools. They had some production to their name. I think they do check some boxes that the Bengals end up moving out of that 10th pick. And I briefly mentioned his name, but I do want to give a shout out to Sonny Styles specifically, because beyond just playing at a major school, being 20 to 21 years old, there is one more threshold that the Bengals typically look for with their first round picks. And it's if you were a 5-star recruit coming out of high school. Jonah Williams was a 5-star. Jamar Chase was a 5-star, at least according to one outlet. Dax Hill, Myles Murphy, Marius Mims, and Shamar Stewart were all consensus 5-star prospects coming out of high school. 5-star recruits, I should say. Sonny Styles of that list of 7 was the only 5-star recruit when he ended up going to Ohio State. Caleb Downs was obviously also a 5-star recruit, and then he eventually went to Ohio State, but the reason why I didn't include him in that list is because I'm not sure the Bengals are actually going to draft a safety now after they sign both Brian Cook and Kyle Duggar. I think a very convoluted scenario would have to occur for the Bengals to end up taking Caleb Downs, who I'm sure they have graded very highly on their board, but I'm just not expecting a safety to be that pick, just like I'm not expecting an offensive lineman to be that pick. So Caleb Downs is also a 5-star. But again, in terms of the guys that I think have a legitimate chance of being the 10th overall pick, if Sonny Styles does make it through the cracks, that would continue that trend as well. We've got 2 long weeks until the NFL draft actually arrives, and we're going to learn a lot more about who the Bengals are bringing in for some of these 30 visits. Typically, the visits that happen later in the process end up being pretty important. I remember Myles Murphy actually came into town about a week before the 2023 draft. No one really expected him to fall that far in the first round, but sure enough, he did, and he ended up being the Bengals pick. Continuing some of these trends in terms of where they went to school, how productive they were, and how old they were. So even if it does look a bit crazy for the Bengals to consider drafting a running back 10th overall, know that Jeremiah Love checks that very important box.